Bruce DuMont back. Thanks very much for joining us in hour number 2 of Beyond the Beltway. And in this segment hour, we are going to be welcomed on the left. We have David Maciotra, who is a writer. And in the center, the libertarian spot, we have Brian Lembrick, who's been a guest on this program. And John Zahm is a Republican, and he joins us for the first time. John, nice to have you with us on Beyond the Beltway.
It's a pleasure, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
I would like to pick up the conversation of the past hour, and I'm going to start with the libertarian. Give us where you would start the conversation of racism in America. What needs to be done? What do blacks need to do? What do whites need to do? Give us a short version or a short answer to that, because I want everybody to weigh in on it. How do we move forward?
The short answer on that is that in every instance, government makes the situation worse. People need to work these things out in society themselves, and generally people want to work together. Everybody wants to have a better life. They want to do business with each other. They want to trade, buy, sell with each other. Then government comes in and decides, you can't go to this school. You can't go into that building. You don't have access to this health care. And then you get a divide that becomes worse and worse because government pits groups of people against each other.
John, I want to go to you and put a fine point on the question. What would you do, and what do you think the Republican Party needs to do to address the issues of some African Americans who believe that there is disparity between the way blacks are treated by the police department versus whites? How would you just go in and try to resolve that?
I think it's important to enact the police reforms that Tim Scott took the lead on in the Senate, and it got stopped in the House. I think there are reforms that are needed, that can address some of these concerns. For example, the idea of licensing of the police is not a new idea, and it's not a Democrat idea. It actually came up 11 years ago in the Illinois legislature by Senator Tim Bivens, who had a whole career in law enforcement, including the Lee County Sheriff. He wanted to see to it that those bad actors, and there's very few of them, I believe, within the police community, but those bad actors, should not be able to go from department to department or state to state with a bad record. That's something that Tim Scott wants to see, and that's something that I think people of both and all parties can embrace.
David Maciotra, our Democrat, pick up on that, and where do we begin addressing just that part of the race issue in the country, the unfair treatment of blacks according to blacks in this country?
Well, if we look at the police issue, police go into neighborhoods and social scenarios as they currently exist. So when there's a killing or an assault, it's a flashpoint. But we tend not to look at the smoldering injustices that lead to that flashpoint. And on that score, I would say that there's great opportunity for unity. For example, 27 million Americans have no health insurance. So comprehensive health care would benefit everybody. It might disproportionately.
How would that stop the actions of a police officer when engaging a black person driving a car? Be specific, because the health care that's a big issue. I think it's a side issue, although it is directly connected. I agree with that. But again, speak to some real practical reason as to why one would affect the other.
Well, the point that I was going to make is that typically these incidents take place in poor neighborhoods, and there's a feeling of inequity and injustice within Black neighborhoods, more generally speaking, throughout the United States for a whole host of reasons, in addition to police mistreatment. But on the issue of police mistreatment, I would say that we need reform in terms of more training. We need to reevaluate the type of scenarios to which police are tasked to address. A gun and a badge aren't the tools necessary to solve every social problem, such as mental illness. And this is, I'm sure, a point of agreement I can find with your other guest, Brian. I think we're overly policed and managed in general. So we need to reevaluate drug laws. We need to reevaluate why police are called to a scenario in the first place and why they feel they need to use force.
Let's go to Brian to follow up on that. And again, focus on the subject let's focus on the police issue. I'll tell you, if we can solve or come up with recommendations on solving the police community issue, we will make a grave step forward. So focus on that and pick up the conversation.
Exactly, and we're going to solve that right here on the show tonight, Bruce. That's what we're going to do.
We'll try.
David brought up the point of the drug laws. Example, both David and John suggested that there needs to be reform, needs to be training. Again, what they're doing is piling more rules and laws on top of an already bad situation. The proposal libertarians have is to change the entire view of things. For example, drug laws. Drug laws are looked at as a criminal justice issue. That's wrong. It should be looked as a healthcare issue. When you do that, you can then get people treatment or help they need, as opposed to automatically treating everybody like a criminal. And those laws, originally created in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, were specifically aimed at Hispanics and Hispanic Americans and African Americans in this country. Their inception was racist at its core.
But would you also acknowledge that if you talked to police officers in Chicago, and there are open drug markets on many corners in the south and west sides of Chicago, many of their customers are suburban white kids from the suburbs. The buyers are white kids. So my question to you is, what should we be doing to the white kids? In other words, what should be done with them when they come into the inner cities and they are sold illicit drugs by black gang leaders?
Now, the word there you said was illicit. You're saying, what should we do to them? Why does it always have to be something done to somebody? If there's not a violent crime being committed, then people should be free to choose what they're doing with each other. I'm not saying.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence, and I want to bring John into it. I think there's a lot of evidence to say that drug trafficking is a non-violent crime or a non-victimless crime. I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
But Bruce, there's a historical precedent.
I want to go to John. John, pick up on the conversation.
Sure, Bruce. I think we're getting off track here. A lot of times libertarians want to bring everything back to the drug legalization issue. I think we're getting off track. Where we need to be on this is body cameras. Body cameras create the ultimate transparency. It protects a good, honest cop who's doing his job, from wrongful claims, wrongful prosecutions. I think we should all be able to agree, and Tim Scott led on this in the Republican police reform. Let's have body cameras on every department, every police officer.
I agree with body cameras in principle and in theory, and I certainly wouldn't oppose it. However, Derek Chauvin had multiple cameras affixed on him. So clearly video recording doesn't prevent the worst of police brutality.
And thank goodness that we had the cameras on so that we could see that horrible thing that happened, and now start taking steps to address it.
Well, what we saw a social media person who basically had the camera there. It wasn't the body camera that saw it, and too often police officers turn body cameras off. I'm Bruce DuMont. Back shortly with calls. Don't go away. Bruce DuMont back on Beyond the Beltway on Independence Day 2020. Nice to have you with us. Let's bring Joseph from Austin, Texas, listening to us on KLBJ, into our discussion on trying to solve racism. Not an easy task, but go ahead, Joe. You're on the air.
Thank you, Bruce. And by the way, congratulations.
Thank
40
you.
years of programming.
Well, we'll keep
Yeah,
keep doing it until we solve one problem.
Hello?
Go ahead. You're on the air.
I don't think the problem in the United States is racism. I think, matter of fact, we have some laws which are reverse racism, favoring women and blacks and minorities for hiring. I think the problem in the United States is black males. They are 7% of the population, but 70% of the people in prison and jails. I think the reason. Hello, are you still there?
Yes, no, we're here. Go ahead.
Okay. I think the reason for this, there are a lot of reasons, but the most striking reason is that 80% of the black males grow up in households without fathers.
Mm-hmm.
I think this creates black males don't know how to deal with authority. If you look at the problems, the situation in Atlanta and the situation in Minneapolis,
let me stop, Joe. Let me stop you for just a second. I want to bring David Masiotra into the discussion because it's a subject that's near and dear to his heart. He's also just finished a book that'll be out soon on the importance of Jesse Jackson in society, and I'm sure that you had conversations with Reverend Jackson about this subject during your many interviews, David.
Yeah, we have, and Jesse Jackson once famously said when he was living in Washington, D.C., that because of higher crime rates among young black males, he regretted that he felt if he was walking down the street toward his home, he would feel under greater threat if a group of young black men were following him than another race. But he added that in the 60s, it was white people threatening him. You brought up Jesse Jackson. So what Jackson would point out, and I would agree with him on this issue, is that we've had decades, if not centuries, of unequal, unjust social conditions, laying down a series of combustible elements in inner cities where you have drugs in and the presence of guns and lack of jobs, lack of opportunity, lack of high-performing schools. So that deficit of opportunity, that deficit of respect, that deficit of assimilation into mainstream society, middle-class society, incentivizes illegal and unhealthy behavior. So therefore, if you want to prevent and mitigate some of those more pathological strains of behavior, you have to address the root causes, which are disparities in education, disparities in economic opportunity, and disparities in healthcare and several other issues.
Would you say, however, that that the black community, by not demanding more of public education, that many of the children in black families are coming out of substandard schools where they don't get the proper education, so they don't get the right jobs, so they can't advance, so they can't put money away, they can't buy a home in the suburbs, and it goes on and on. But it comes right back to, and again, I would say you could take one step further and say a lack of a father in the household, which is also a problem. It's a problem not only in the black community, but a problem in the white community. If you don't have a father in the household and you don't sit around and have dinner with each other as a family unit, your likelihood of going to prison or having a bad outcome in life is significantly higher. But it goes back to, I guess the broader question is, can the black community be more insistent that their local public school be more proficient than it has been for 50 years? David.
Well, yes. Well, I think you're painting with a broad brush. Black organizations, black churches are very much involved with school systems. Jackson's organization, Rainbow Push, has had Push Excel, which works with the school systems in operation since the 1970s. But much of the problems of inner city schools are not a local issue. Much of it's a funding mechanism. You have funding for schools based upon not the child's worth, but the property tax base surrounding that school. That's not something that the families, the parents, the children within those communities can change. So that's a very clear example of a child growing up in Naperville or on the north side of Chicago, or for your national audience, a wealthy suburb, has a whole series of advantages and benefits that a child growing up in a poor inner city school lacks. And clearly that's no fault of the child's. The child doesn't choose where to be born, where to go to school. So that's a national structural problem that needs a national structural solution.
Is it ever going to is it ever going to happen though with the democratic control of big cities? John Zahm, your response to that?
Yes, the solution here is parental choice. Our public schools have been failing, especially in the inner cities, the big cities, for so many years. We've seen in Milwaukee where they implemented parental choice. We've seen in Florida, which actually started with a Democrat governor implementing school choice and progressed from there into Republican leadership. That school choice can get these children, out of poverty, and get them, let the dollars follow the student. That's been a problem. That's something that Republicans have talked about for a long time, libertarians as well. But the Democratic Party, because of their allegiance to teacher unions, have not made the progress on this that we need.
Brian, I want to ask you a question. Thanks for your call, Joseph. Brian, I want to ask you a question. When we have discussions of race, are we spending too much time talking about black people and we should be talking about white people or the broader community instead?
When people recently have been talking about Black Lives Matter, it happens everywhere. That there's a large amount of violence that happens to the Hispanic community in the country. Black Lives Matter. I don't want to say something that people will take to misconstrue something, but there are Hispanics that get attacked. There are video footage of white people, of anybody who are in their house minding their own business, and a no-knock raid is on the wrong house, and innocent people get shot. It's a systemic thing that starts within it. But with regards to your question about it, there are parts that people need to start at in order to have those discussions. For example, as a libertarian, we've been calling for things like an end to qualified immunity for decades. Finally, people are talking about it because Black Lives Matter, because we've seen what's happened. So the changes that need to take place are finally being discussed in mainstream media and with the average person.
Let's go to Mark in Carmel, California. Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, good evening, Bruce. So let me start off, and I tried to get through last weekend. Congratulations, dude. You started the whole deal. You were here before Rush. You are a rock star, and you always have been. It took me years to find you, and thank God for iHeartRadio.
Well, thank you very much for saying that, Mark.
Thank God, and listen, so just let me cut back to the chase here to your prior hour. Okay, so as of 2 hours ago, the Chicago butcher bill this weekend was, as of 2 hours ago, and the weekend's young yet, because we're not done with the weekend, was 85 shot, 24 dead. Okay, listen, we're talking about the 20 top cities in America that are run by Democrats, which was a point brought up in the prior hour. Until we can start getting a handle on that inner city violence, and tell me, who are they calling when those 85 shots, 85 people who were wounded and 24 were dead, who are they calling? Are they calling a social worker? My God, no. Of course they call the police, and the thing to defund the police. So I realize while your guests are talking about all these ethereal things about inner city education, we must throw more money at it. We must move on and do this and that and the other thing. Until we can solve the fundamental problems in the inner city, which was all created through the best of intentions, because we all had the best of intentions back in the early 60s.
Right.
We're going to build apartment houses for everybody.
Yep.
And within 2 years, they became rat hole-infested drug-dealing dens. Well, it was an experiment that went wrong, so we need a new experiment. But the experiment is not to defund the police. The experiment is to clean out your houses and get your own stuff organized before you go on some national campaign that tells everybody else what the hell to do. Because in my county, we don't have the issues you have in your county.
Well, the issue clearly is each individual community has got to handle what is happening in that community, and they have to engage. It has to be a broad discussion, and I don't think it necessarily just has to be a discussion amongst black people. I mean, blacks have got to be there as part of the integral part of the discussion, but the clergy should be involved, and the unions should be involved. The unions should not be there to protect a fiefdom or a system that does not produce quality education. That goes back to the House. Most people should. Bruce DuMont back. Thank you very much for joining us tonight on this Independence weekend. I think I might have said Independence Day, but it's Independence weekend. And I hope you had an opportunity to enjoy it with your friends and family. And as I said at the beginning of the program, I had a great opportunity to head to Western Illinois, northwestern Illinois, the Galena Territory, which is where Ulysses S. Grant is one of the claims to fame of that great city and a small town. It's the prettiest city in Illinois, and also right across the river is the Dubuque, Iowa, and right on the banks of the Mississippi River. So it's a beautiful time. If you're looking for a new place to go and you're within the sound of my voice, at least in the Midwest, if you've not been there, I would highly recommend it. Let's go to guests who I will also highly recommend, and we will let them take a moment to introduce themselves and tell everybody a little bit about themselves. And David Masiotra, we'll start with you.
Thank you for having me, Bruce. It's always a pleasure. I'm a columnist with Salon and the author of several books, including the forthcoming book that you were kind enough to mention earlier, I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters.
Brian Lambrick.
Hey, Bruce. First of all, happy 40th anniversary.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled to know that as a kid, when I was 15 years old, I discovered you on WLS and didn't know what the conversations were about back then. And now, all these years later, I'm a guest on your show, and I sometimes still don't know what the conversations are about.
Now, by the way, I heard the same story from David Masiotra. High school,
I
right?
also started viewing as a high school student. So
Wow.
from student viewer to panelist again, quite a journey.
Okay. John, you're making
Yeah,
your
it's fun.
first appearance on the show. Tell us a little bit about you.
Absolutely, long-time listener, so good to be on.
Good.
I founded Goliath Slayer Communications, a political and nonprofit consulting firm. I've been doing this 30 years, and now my three sons, Daniel, Jonah, and Sam, have joined me in the business. I'm also a local elected school board member and school board president, as well as a appointed village clerk.
John, as a Republican, how would you assess the president's popularity with Republicans?
It all depends on where you are. I'm in the same congressional district that you visited. I love Galena. I'm in the 17th district, Western Illinois. President Trump won this district by 9 points, even though the Congresswoman is Democrat. So he's quite popular out here. But when you go, obviously, into the big cities and even some suburbs, not so much. But I think a lot of momentum is coming out of that Mount Rushmore speech and the patriotism that he evoked. And the race can go in a lot of different directions still. It's changing every day.
David, I don't know whether you saw the speech or read the speech. Were you aghast by it, as some people at the network level, certainly Andrea Mitchell was falling all over herself, denouncing it today? What was your reaction, if indeed you saw it or heard it or read about it?
I watched it live. I wasn't aghast, but I was confused and embarrassed by it, because we have 133,000 dead from the coronavirus. The pandemic is worsening, while European nations are returning to their normal routine, pre-pandemic routine. We're setting daily records on new case additions. And the president is seemingly more focused and concerned about protecting statues and discussing monuments. So I wasn't aghast, but I saw it as a critical failure of leadership and an act of negligence.
What should he be doing? What should he be saying and doing now, in your opinion?
Well, we could start out simple. First of all, he should be strongly suggesting that everyone wear a mask, something he's refused to do since day one. He should be making better and more frequent use out of the Defense Production Act to ensure that all healthcare workers and nursing home workers are fully stocked and supplied with PPE.
Hasn't he done that already?
He should do the same to make sure that we have adequate testing. Despite all of his boasting about testing, all public health experts agree that we have inadequate testing. Right. He should also work with, Mr. Art of the Deal should be convening with House Democrats and with Senate Republicans to more aggressively address the 40 million people who are currently unemployed. And he should also, this is important, it's the least important, but it's important, use his power as communicator in chief to express empathy, sensitivity, and solidarity with the victims, their family members, and the healthcare professionals treating them.
All right.
Rather
I want to go to Brian, and I want to find out whether, Brian, you agree or disagree with some of the points that were just ticked off by David.
By David. Yes. First of all, I like that David said the president should be suggesting things. I don't like when the government tries to threaten people or pass edicts in order to force people to a certain behavior. We see that
no
in Illinois,
mask.
we see it in
You're a no mask guy. Are you a no mask guy, or let whoever wants to wear a mask can wear one?
Yes, and I wear a mask when I go into stores because the stores ask me, or if I go to places, I walk in the door, I always have it in my pocket, they ask me, I will comply with them, I will do that. But as soon as the government's going to tell me that now I absolutely have to do something, well, screw the government. I don't want somebody ordering me, but people are generally pretty good with complying with the businesses and restaurants when they're given the freedom to do so. We've seen it.
John, do you think that the government has been clear and consistent in delivering a message? And when I say government, I mean you've got the federal government, and sometimes the federal government is telling you different things than state governments. Who is the average person who should they side with?
I think the federal government has been good from the beginning in being transparent. The coronavirus task force, all of the different information that we get and continue to get. What I've been concerned about is individual states, like my home state of Illinois, which has gone too far in terms of the mandatory edicts and orders, things that don't make sense. The idea of how
but it has one of the best records insofar as cases and deaths. I mean, Illinois, when at least when the national news media gives all of their assessments and charts, Illinois seems to be doing the right thing, maybe not for business, but for COVID-19 cases.
The numbers vary depending on who's presenting them, and what I've found is that in the rural parts of Illinois, it's never really been a very big problem. In my home county, 50,000 people, we've had exactly one death. The problems have been where people are concentrated, like in the city of Chicago and some of the busier suburbs. But no, I don't think the governor here has handled things right. And at what cost? You've got a human and a social cost when you've got everyone locked down. You've got mental health issues. You've got domestic abuse on the rise. Children are not getting properly educated because of this remote and distance learning that's not being effectively implemented and isn't working. So there's tremendous cost to the way some of these governors have shut things down.
I want to go back to Brian. Brian, do you think, in the people that you speak with, I assume you speak with people that are not just libertarians, but are people that you run into, are they blaming the president for COVID-19?
They're blaming him for COVID getting a little bit worse. And basically the thing that the president does, nobody should be shocked or aghast at anything he says anymore. It's pretty much routine with what he does. It's an Independence Day weekend, and he goes out and gives a speech where he starts complaining about statues, and he's talking about rioters and protesters as if they're one and the same. So people are upset with Trump over all of those things. But a lot of the COVID issues, it's pretty much the states, it's the towns, the cities, the counties. On the local level, everyone's figuring out how bad it is. I can't remember if it was David or John, but somebody said the rest of Illinois is handling it completely differently. People are being responsible on their own, and you don't have to arrest anybody or issue tickets, take their money, punish them. The rest of the state is handling it pretty well. It's only concentrated in Chicago where it's becoming a big problem. And that's where the rules are the harshest.
Sam from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina joins us this evening. Go ahead, Sam. Welcome to Beyond the Beltway.
Thanks, Bruce. I've been watching this couple from St. Louis, as you know.
Yes.
I have a little bit different take on that.
Go ahead.
This guy's calling for the police now to come in and help. For 30 years, him and his wife have been trial personal injury attorneys,
Mm-hmm.
and they have sued the police department. They used to be what was called ambulance chasers.
Mm-hmm.
For 30 years, they have been suing police departments, especially the St. Louis Police Department, on behalf of largely black clients. And they built their mansion and made their fortune on that. And now that the mob has turned on him, he is crying for the police to come and save him. It's almost poetic justice.
Okay.
And by the way,
By the way,
just the ground troops, they're the brown shirts for the agent provocateurs for the left and the Marxists, the Democrats. Everybody knows that.
May I speak on this, Bruce?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. To me, the story that really comes out of St. Louis is not the personal merits or demerits of that particular couple. It's the fact that they're legal gun owners and they're protecting their property against people that had burst through their gate, and were shouting, and were literally being riotous. And the right to the Second Amendment is paramount, especially at this time. We see all the people that are exercising their rights and buying guns as well. They should, to protect their homes and property. That's the message that I get out of St. Louis.
You are also not seeing many Democrats at the moment bring out the Second Amendment card. I think they're fearful of that issue exploding in their face, no pun intended. I'm Bruce DuMont, back shortly with our last segment of the night. Bruce DuMont back. The president is imposing a $10,000 fine for anyone that defaces federal property, statues, or any kind of federal property. I think that's probably popular with a lot of people, including independents. That might even be popular with some Democrats, because whereas the issue of protesting police brutality, I think, is a legitimate issue to be discussed and also protested in the streets to get the attention of everyone, which they obviously have, the idea of taking the law in your own hands and defacing public property, whether it is a Confederate general or whether it is a former president of the United States, and destroying it and tearing it down, that is lawlessness. Lawlessness cannot be accepted, and those who are involved in any sort of a conspiracy to create and spread lawlessness, like the president has suggested with some fire bombings and some of those that may be part of Antifa or a similar group that is looting and creating mayhem in cities. I don't think anyone, even Democrats, really don't want it. They just can't. They just don't have the ability to stand up and say it. They can't say it. Democrats can't get tough about anything. The only thing they get tough about is talking about Donald Trump. But the president has said he wants to get tough, and he's getting tough on these issues. But I think, saying that someone's going to go to the clinker for 10 years for defacing a statue of George Washington, I don't think there's many people that disagree with that sentiment. David Mastriotti, do you agree with what I just said?
Well, which part? You said an awful lot there.
Well, I want you to just blanket accept it all. No, the question is a $10,000 fine for anyone that defaces federal property. Is that a reasonable? Obviously, they've got to go through a court. They've got to be convicted of it. I'm not saying take them out and just have them sign a check. But don't you think that's a majoritarian position at this point?
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with the fine. But my larger point is, at the risk of repeating myself, we live in a country with some pretty severe social crises.
Yes.
And we're devoting a lot of time to discussion of statues and monuments. The risk is we all begin to look rather silly. So, child poverty's on the rise. Illiteracy rates are on the rise.
I do believe we can
Joblessness is on the rise, but we'll talk about
those things. We can
statues.
do all those things. But the point is, and this is where I think you have to draw a line between Republicans and Democrats. The point is, it's lawlessness. Are you for lawlessness, or are you going to stand up and speak against lawlessness? When it comes to standing up and speaking against lawlessness and drawing a line so nobody can misinterpret what you say, the Democrats look weak. They look weak.
Well,
They cannot come out and be emphatic about saying that something is wrong, because they're fearful that part of their constituency is going to be offended by what they say, because they're going to be perceived as being racist because they don't believe that a statue of Abraham Lincoln should be torn down. Or, as our guest in the first hour suggested, because there's a picture of an African American who is on his knees below Abraham Lincoln, that somehow is racist, even though it was slaves that it raised the money to build the statue.
First of all, I don't know if you're correct, because in the past week, Joe Biden, who's the nominee for president in the Democratic Party, probably the most important Democrat right now, has said that he would favor a legal process to remove Confederate monuments, but want other monuments to stay in place. At the same time, you talk about lawlessness. Don't forget the Republican Party, most especially Mitch McConnell, are collectively insisting on corporate immunity within the next coronavirus relief package, which means that corporations that violate health and safety standards and endanger their workers and consumers will face no legal penalty or consequence. So that's a whole nother way of talking about this issue of lawlessness and criminality.
Well,
I think we're getting off track. May I comment?
Yeah, go ahead, John. I agree.
Yeah,
go ahead.
The issue here is that a statue, by definition, is a symbol. And if you tear down a symbol of our government, and you do it in a violent, reckless manner like they've been doing with these mobs, it tears the very fabric of our society apart. That's why I definitely believe the severe penalties are in place, or should be put in place. And there's the hypocrisy of the statues that are getting torn down. You've got abolitionists getting torn down, Ulysses S. Grant, who defeated the Confederacy. It's outrageous, George Washington, that what these Democrat protesters and radical protesters are doing is beyond the pale. We have to do something about it.
Brian, do you see a clear line there or not?
I think this is a great time to start having a discussion about how we stop using taxpayer dollars to pay for statues to be put up of politicians and political figures and historical figures. If people want to put up a statue, let them raise the money and do it privately. Stop spending taxpayer dollars on it.
Brian,
but get back to the rioting, Brian, please.
We're talking about statues that have been up there for 50 to 75 years. Those things are paid for. And by the way, many of them were paid for by private funds. They were not all paid for by tax dollars. You're like behind the curve on this.
Have them sold off and give the money, give the taxpayers a tax break.
Okay. All right. On that note, we say farewell to our libertarian, Brian Lambrecht, to our left of center guest, David Masiotra, the great progressive writer, whose new book on Jesse Jackson will be coming out shortly, and John Zahm, who's a political consultant making his first appearance on this program. We thank you all for being with us on this Independence Day version of Beyond the Beltway. Our thanks to Andrew Marshall and Fritz Goldman, and also Todd Nebel for their assistance in this program. I'm Bruce DuMont. Until next week, good night from Evanston, Illinois.